And now it's over to yourselves, and enjoy, everybody.
Thanks, Kevin. Just one question: is that for swearing also apply to speakers or just to attendees? Yeah, just kidding, of course. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Data Weekender from Andy and my side. And since we have a lot of things to cover, I suggest that we jump straight into short introduction. Yeah, my name is Nikola Ilic. I'm working as an independent data platform consultant and trainer. You can find me on web. I'm blogging on data-mozart.com, and also you can find me on social media like LinkedIn and Twitter. So feel free to connect if you like. Andy, handing over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nikola. So yeah, my name is Andy Cutler, and I'm an Azure Data Platform consultant. And yeah, I work primarily with Synapse Analytics. And yes, the QR code, I'll take you to Twitter, as it will with Nikola's QR code as well. So, feel free to, ask more questions on Twitter afterwards. But yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, so I guess you are already familiar with this new certification because you jump into our session. Here on this slide, the last paragraph is of key importance. So just to be clear, this session will not get you ready for passing the exam, as we would probably need a few full days of training to cover all the skills, all the concepts and tools needed. Our goal here today is to provide you with a high-level overview of the essential tools and skills that are part of the exam. So you can then go and focus on learning those essential tools and skills instead of wasting time on some less important stuff. Of course, we'll discuss some of the concepts and features that we consider especially important in more detail, but generally, this is not a deep dive session on any of the specific topics covered by the DP 500 exam. So, Andy, handing over to you again.
So let me share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of let me go back one slide to the candidate profile. So ultimately, who would be interested in the DP 500? We've had questions around who should be doing this certification, or should they be doing something like the PL 300, the Power BI certification? Well, really, it's all about the responsibilities. So if you are using Power BI predominantly to load data models, yes, we've got that word enterprise. Yeah, it's in the certification. If you're cleaning and transforming data with M, and you're responsible for some development, some ALM, some application lifecycle management, some deployment processes as well, this fits quite nicely into that. Where this enterprise data analyst can fit in an organization, right, is where they're responsible for some of the data governance that's going on with these, the technology that we'll see, monitoring how those tools are being used, so Power BI, optimizing performance. And ultimately, if you're going to sit the exam, what should you know? Okay, now there's that very top level item that says advanced Power BI skills, which is a little fuzzy. Okay, this is what we're going to go through in this certification. Yes, you need to be reasonably proficient in Power Query, not an expert, and some DAX as well. Then this is where we go off the track of Power BI and we talk about Synapse Analytics. Yeah, so you're going to need to know some T-SQL and various commands that are specific to Synapse Analytics there, and with visualizing data. Okay, both in Power BI, but also in Synapse Analytics. Now, in terms of the skills measured breakdown, so Microsoft publish, a PDF that you can download, and it'll give you all the individual skills categorized about what you should know. And it's obviously the perfect way to start your learning journey, okay? Because each of those skills measured will relate to a piece of documentation that Microsoft have available, or a learning module. And there's plenty of blogs out there as well, Nikola and I included. So first, we've got implement and manage a data analytics environment. Okay, bearing in mind there are 4 skills being measured, and each of those skills is roughly 25 to 30%. There's no heavy skew in one way or the other. So we're going to query and transform data. So that's not only M, that's DAX, that's SQL in Synapse Analytics. When we're looking at implementing and managing data models, yes, we've got enterprise data models, large-scale data models in Power BI, and exploring and visualizing data in both Power BI and Synapse Analytics. In total, in that skills measure document is about 49 individual skills being measured. And as Nikola has mentioned earlier, we won't be deep diving into every single one of those. Otherwise, it would be a 5-day training course. In terms of visualizing the services that this certification encompasses, front and center, Power BI. Of course it is. Yeah. So we've got Power BI there. We have Purview, okay, because Purview, from a data governance perspective, we have Synapse Analytics, where we have some SQL pools to discuss. Data Lake Gen 2, that both Synapse Analytics and Power BI can make use of. And DevOps, Azure DevOps for source control. And we have our tools, our external tools on the right-hand side with DAX Studio, Tabular Editor 2, and VertiPaq Analyzer that we will get to towards the end of the session. Now, where does the role fit in an organization? Yes, this role probably doesn't exist by name, but guaranteed there's people out there doing this role. Okay, so right in the center, enterprise data analyst. Okay, they'll be working with solution architects. Solution architects may be a little bit higher level. That enterprise data analyst will know some of that lower level work with Power BI and Synapse and DevOps. Of course, data engineers working on the Synapse analytics side of things. But data scientists who will maybe be working within Power BI, maybe using some Python. And AI engineers as well. So we've got, we'll be looking at a predict syntax within Synapse Analytics. Of course, database administrators, right? Those database administrators are going to want to know, if they're working with cloud data platforms, what they should know when these tools are talking to each other. And Power BI data analysts as well, who maybe don't really work day to day in querying data sources like Synapse Analytics, and would need to know or have that person in a role that can help them. Now, in terms of the session content breakdown, I'm going to cover this pretty quickly. We've got Purview, Power BI, Synapse Analytics, and external tools. So we're going to jump straight into Microsoft Purview. Okay, so with Microsoft Purview, we've got 2 items that we want to look at. Okay, integrating Purview with Power BI. Okay, and using 2 of the features within Purview, which is the data map and the data catalog, to browse assets and to register assets. So when we're looking at integrating and scanning Power BI with Purview, okay, yes, we've explained before that Purview is that data governance side of the DP500. And what that allows us to do is to scan and register what's called assets. Now, an asset in the world of Power BI can be a dashboard, can be a report, a data set, and data flows. And what you'll see is you'll see some lineage. Now, the red writing is just me overlaying those assets onto a diagram. So you can see we've got our source data, which in this case is an Azure SQL database. We have data flows, data sets, reports, and dashboards all connected together in the lineage view. Okay, so with Purview, we're going to be using the data catalog to be able to view our Power BI assets. In terms of general usage of Purview, we're going to concentrate on the data map and the data catalog. Okay, now with the data map, that is what allows us to register data sources. So a Power BI tenant, a Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool, a serverless SQL pool, an Azure SQL database, a data lake. That's where we're going to register our data sources and initiate scans to discover assets. But also the data catalog part, that's where we're going to browse. Okay. Now we can either browse by what's called a collection, which is a logical grouping of assets, or we can browse by data source type. So we can click Power BI and view all our Power BI assets. And we can also search for assets as well. And that's also where we can define the business glossary and link business glossary terms to our assets. Okay. So if you have owners, you can flag those owners and tag them onto Power BI assets. And with that, I will hand over to Nikola to go through the Power BI side.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. So these are the topics that we will cover in this Power BI subsection of our session. And let's start with composite models. So if you're talking with Power BI professionals, you may hear them talking about two different composite model features. Don't be afraid and don't be surprised because I will now quickly draw the line between those two. So first one is composite models. These features just called composite models. These features lets you combine data coming from two different direct query sources, data coming from direct query and import mode, or any combination between those data sources. And this feature will be the main focus of our session. On the other hand, there is also so-called composite models Gen 2. It's not Gen 2, it's not official name for this feature. You may also hear terms like composite model V2 or something, a new composite model and so on. However, the official name is Direct Query for Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services. And this version of composite models is still in public preview, so we will not cover it today in this session. But basically, just for you to know the difference, it lets you connect to a published Power BI dataset and use this connection in combination with other direct query and or import mode data. So what are the composite models? Yeah, in the dark ages of Power BI, if you wanted to use direct query as a source for your report, once you've chosen direct query for a certain data source, like SQL Server, for example, the possibility to extend on this was literally gone. So to put it simple, you couldn't combine a direct query over one data source, like SQL Server, with a direct query, let's say, over another data source, for example, Oracle database. And let alone combine direct query with import mode. That was impossible. Luckily, these times are behind us, as now you can create a data model in Power BI that consists of, let's say, data coming from Excel file which is stored on your local machine, imported data from the SQL Server table, then direct query that retrieves data from another SQL Server table, and direct query that retrieves the data from Oracle database table. All imported data sources, like let's say in our example, you see on your screen Excel file and imported SQL Server table, are being treated as one single artifact because the data is stored in the local instance of the analysis services that Power BI uses to store imported data. So from a composite model perspective, that's one source. You can think of it as one source. Also in the illustration, you see there are two direct query data sources, SQL Server and Oracle, and each of them contains data from multiple tables. The power of composite models is that now you can establish the relationship between the data stored in the VertiPaq, which is imported data, and data that resides outside of Power BI. Now, if you ask yourself why some arrows here in this illustration are dashed and others not, yeah, that's a good question. So those arrows basically represent relationships between the tables in different storage environments. Tabular models supports two types of relationships, regular and limited. Maybe you will hear terms like strong and weak relationships, but the official name is regular and limited. Explaining this behavior, of course, would require at least half an hour. All considerations and limitations of these two types, especially limitations when it comes to limited relationships. But I would wholeheartedly recommend to read blog article from SQL BI guys. I think Alberto wrote a fantastic article to understand all the nuances and potential caveats of having limited relationships in your data model. To cut the story short, from the perspective of successful Power BI developer, you should keep in mind two things when it comes to composite models. First one is you can create relationships between the data coming from different storage mode sources. That's the one. The second one, you must be aware of the behavior of these relationships, especially of limited relationships. Okay, next topic that we would like to discuss is about aggregations. And it's important to keep in mind, again, that there are two different types of aggregations in Power BI. User-defined aggregations were up until a few months ago the only aggregation type in Power BI. Here, you are in charge of defining and managing aggregations, even though Power BI later automatically identifies aggregations when executing your query. On the other hand, automatic aggregations are one of the newer features in Power BI, and they're at this moment they are still in public preview. With automatic aggregations feature enabled, you can relax, grab a coffee, and yeah, machine learning algorithms in background will collect all the data about your queries, identify most frequently running queries in your reports, and automatically build aggregations to support those queries. The important distinction between these two types, of course, besides the fact that with automatic aggregations, you don't need to do anything except to turn on this feature in your tenant, is licensing limitations. So the first one, user-defined aggregations, will work with both Premium and Pro. Automatic aggregations will work at this moment, they require a Premium license. From now on, we will talk just about user-defined aggregations. Just keep that in mind. So if you're wondering what's the point in aggregating the data, well, the final goal is to reduce the number of rows and consequentially reduce the overall data model size by preparing the data in advance. So if I need to see the total sales amount spent by my customer X on product Y in the first quarter of this year, I can take advantage of having this data already summarized in advance. Now, the key ingredient for aggregations to work is that we need to make Power BI aware of these aggregations, because creating aggregations per se is not enough to speed up your Power BI reports. You need to explicitly instruct Power BI about aggregated tables, so queries then can be targeted to those aggregated tables. And just one remark before we proceed further, aggregation awareness is something that will work only and only if the original fact table uses direct query storage mode. To recap, when you're using aggregations in Power BI, this is how you should configure storage modes for your tables. This is recommended way, of course. You can also keep aggregated tables in direct query mode. It's not forbidden. The most important thing is that you need to keep original table in direct query storage mode. And if your aggregated table or tables are in import mode, then set your dimension tables to dual mode, like I did here. You see on this illustration, those blue dashed lines on the top of this illustration means that dimension tables are set to dual storage mode. Okay, next topic. Yeah, as a DAX newbie, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you don't need variables. Simply said, why would you care about the variables if your DAX statement consists of only 1 or 2 lines of code? However, you will see as time goes by and you become more and more proficient with DAX and you start writing more complex calculations, you will start to appreciate the concept of variables. And when I say more complex calculations, I mean using nested functions and possible reusing of this expression logic. Moreover, in many cases, variables may significantly improve the performance of your calculation because expression will be evaluated by the engine only once instead of multiple times. Finally, using variables enables you to easier debug the code and verify results for the certain parts of your formula. You can see on your screens a simple example of using variables in the DAX code. Another topic that is related to DAX and that DP500 covers is handling blanks. And there are multiple ways to do it in DAX. Two most common ways are using, first one is using an if statement and then checking if the certain expression evaluates to blank. But you can also use a more elegant solution with coalesce function. For those coming from SQL world, this is a well-known function. But let me briefly explain for those who are maybe not familiar with it. Basically, coalesce will walk through the values that you passed as an argument and return the first non-blank value. However, and this is really important to remember, be very careful when you are replacing blanks in your DAX formulas, because that can neglect the engine's capability to include the non-empty implicit filter, which essentially, to make things simple, this non-empty filter excludes the rows where there are no matching records. So once you replace the blank with some explicit value like 0, for example, you will get a full cross-join query of dimension table set that will potentially decrease the query performance. Not always, but be careful with this. For some data sources, now we are talking about data refresh performance. So for some data sources, such as relational databases, but also for some non-relational data sources, like OData or Active Directory, for example, Mashup engine is able to translate M language to a language that this underlying data source will understand. In most cases, this is SQL, of course. What's the point in doing this? Yeah, but basically by pushing those complex calculations and transformations directly to a data source, Power Query takes advantage of those powerful relational database engines that are built to cope with large amounts of data in the most efficient way. And that ability of Power Query's mashup engine to create a single SQL statement that will combine all M statements behind your transformations is what we call query folding. Or let's try to make it simple. If the mashup engine is able to generate a single SQL query that's going to be executed on the data source side, we say that the query folds. Now, as we explained, what is a query folding? Let's examine why is it important to achieve this behavior, or maybe it's better to say, why should you care if the query folds or not? First, when you're using import mode in Power BI, data refresh process will work way more efficient when the query folds, both in terms of refresh speed and resource consumption. If you're working with direct query or dual storage mode, as you are basically targeting directly your SQL database, all your transformations must fold or your solution will simply not work. And finally, query folding is also very important when you are implementing incremental refresh feature. It's so important that Power BI will warn you once it determines that query folding can't be achieved. It will not break your incremental refresh process, but without query folding in place, incremental refresh wouldn't serve its main purpose, and that's to reduce the amount of data that needs to be refreshed in your data model. Because without query folding, mashup engine will retrieve all data from the source and then apply all your subsequent steps for data transformation. With all this in mind, you should tend to achieve query folding whenever possible. And one important disclaimer here, if your report is slow, or your visuals need a lot of time to render, or your data model size is large, query folding has nothing to do with it. So only if your data refresh or incremental refresh is slow and inefficient, you should investigate your Power Query steps in more depth. And one more thing, if you ask yourself, is query folding all or nothing thing in Power BI? No, it's not. That means if you have, let's say, 8 transformation steps within Power Query Editor, and your query folds until 6th step or 5th step, you will still get some benefit from partial query folding. However, once the query folding is broken, it can't be achieved anymore. So to simplify, if you have, like I have here, 9 transformation steps, and my query folding is broken at 5th step, all previous steps will fold, but once the folding is broken, it can't be achieved again. Takeaway from this example is try to push all non-foldable steps down this transformation pipeline as much as possible. Next important thing when you are choosing storage mode for your tables is related to direct query. And I know, and I saw a lot of examples when someone thought that using direct query storage mode will improve the performance of Power BI reports. That's one of the biggest fallacies, to be honest. And I would say you should use direct query literally in 3 and only 3 scenarios. First one is, of course, if your data size is so large that you simply can't use import mode in Power BI. For pro licenses, that's 1 GB per data set. For premium, I think you should not go into any problem in 99.9% of cases. Just if you're dealing with really huge amounts of data, then maybe you can't use import mode. Next one is also valid requirement to have a near real-time reporting solution. Because when you're using import mode, Power BI keeps the snapshot of your data. And now let's say that business requirement is to have data with maximum 5-minute latency. I mean, obviously you can't refresh data so frequently to satisfy this request. However, always check with your users, is it really necessary to have data so frequently refreshed, and try to explain them all the downsides of using direct query mode. And from my experience, in many cases, users will admit that maybe they don't really need real-time data. And finally, third reason, in those situations when security policies are defined on the data source side, because report consumers' credentials will be propagated to this underlying data source, and security rules will be applied there. Next thing, also important to keep in mind when it comes to preparing for the exam, licensing options in Power BI. This is the topic that causes a lot of confusion from my experience, and so I decided just to make it as simple as possible. So there are 2 possible ways to obtain Power BI license. It is per user or per capacity. So if we are talking about user licensing options, you are paying for each user that uses a specific license. There are 2 models here. One is Pro license, which costs at this moment $10 per month. And the other one is premium per user, which costs double of that amount, so $20 per month. Then we have licenses per capacity, where you are paying paying a certain amount of dollars per capacity. Of course, this price depends on the capacity features, number of cores, and so on and so on. But important thing to keep in mind is that when you're creating Power BI content, you are assigning this content to capacity. So you can't assign content to a user. Even though users have premium license, you can't assign content to a user itself, so only to capacity. So when it comes to sharing options, I want you to pay attention to those 3 no's, because this is important when considering which license type is right for the certain scenario or for use case in the exam. If you choose to use premium per user license, then keep in mind that only premium per user users with premium per user license also can access this content. So you can't share content from created by users with premium per user with, for example, users who have pro licenses. So this is a very handy table to understand the basics of sharing options. And I would say premium capacity, so paying for capacity, makes sense for a large number of consumers, of your content consumers. If you have, let's say, more than 300 or more than 500 consumers of the content, it makes sense for you from cost-effective perspective. It makes sense to pay for premium capacity. Also, premium capacity makes sense for very large data models, as you already explained. Pro shared capacity comes with certain limitations. Also, Pro license for user comes with certain limitations. So if you are dealing with large amounts of data, premium capacity absolutely makes sense. And finally, premium per user, this latest type of license that was introduced last year, make sense for small number of users that need premium features. So if you have, for example, 20, 30, 50 users and you need to take advantage of features like deployment pipelines or paginated reports and so on, XML or XMLA, read write and so on, it makes sense to pay, like, I don't know, if you have 30 users, then it makes sense to pay $600 and have premium features at low cost. The next one is about creating reusable assets. So when you're working with Power BI content, there are three possible types of assets that you can create. First one is, I guess you probably all know this one, PBIX, which contains everything. So it contains connections, data sets, transformations, visualizations, but the most important thing is that also includes data, so real data that you are using for your reports. Another option is to export your, when you're done with creating Power BI report, you can export this as a Power BI template or PBIT file type. This one is basically the same as the previous one, but it contains no data. So it contains only metadata, information about data model, report pages, and so on, but no real data. And finally, the last one is Power BI dataset, which is PBIDS, which in the end saves only the link to the data source. So it's also very useful in some scenarios. Please keep in mind those three types of reusable assets, as I'm quite sure that this will be one of the topics in the exam. I think this is the last thing I will talk in this part. So deployment pipeline is a relatively not new feature, but I would say still work in progress, and because new capabilities are continuously being deployed. So deployment pipeline, first of all, is a Power BI object with its own set of permissions. So you assign pipeline to a certain workspace, but be careful as permissions for deployment pipelines are being handled separately from workspace permissions. That's important to keep in mind. To implement a secure and easy workflow, plan in advance who will get access to each part of the pipeline. And some of the considerations to take into account are who should have access to the pipeline, which operations should users with pipeline access be able to perform in each stage, who will review content in the test stage, and so on and so on. Next important thing when it comes to deployment pipelines is about using parameters. So as you can't edit data sets, data sources in Power BI service, it is recommended practice to use parameters to store connection details, such as, for example, instance names or database names, and use them instead of using a static connection string. This allows you to manage these connections through the Power BI service web portal or using APIs at a later stage. In deployment pipelines, you can configure parameter rules to set specific values for the development, for test, and for production stages. If you don't use parameters for your connection string, you can define data source rules to specify a connection string for a given data set. Parameters also have additional use cases, such as making changes to queries, filters, and the text displayed in the report. Finally, automation, and this will also be a very important topic. You can leverage the deployment pipelines, Power BI REST APIs to integrate Power BI into your organization's automation process. Few examples of what can be done using the APIs are you can manage pipelines from start to finish, including creating pipeline, assigning a workspace to any stage, and deploying and deleting the pipeline. You can also assign and unassign users from a pipeline. You can integrate Power BI into familiar DevOps tools such as Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, and you can also schedule deployment pipelines to happen automatically at a given time. Final remark regarding deployment pipelines: everything that I said about deployment pipelines applies only if you are working with premium capacity. So deployment pipelines is a premium feature only. yeah, this is the last thing, sorry, for accessibility. As you may know, the same report you create in Power BI may look completely different across different devices. For example, a report that contains exactly the same data points looks quite different on a desktop if you compare this to a mobile devices or mobile phones or tablets, for example. Similar applies to different persons. So you have to keep in mind that your users might have some visual, motor or cognitive impairments. So the same report may look different from the perspective of users with deficiencies. And if you ask yourself why accessibility matters, let me show you a very basic example. If you are a normal person, and when I say normal, I mean you don't have any visual impairments, that's how you will see this nice colorful balloon flying over these green fields. But if you are diagnosed with deuteranopia, which is a medical name for green blindness, that's how this same balloon will look like in your scene through your eyes. We prepare here a list of the built-in and configurable accessibility features in Power BI. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to walk through each of them, but make sure to check this list and apply these features once you start building your Power BI reports. Andy, handing over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay. Now we're going to go into Synapse Analytics. Okay, now don't worry too much. This isn't going to go into any heavy data engineering because that's not what DP 500 is all about. That is a specific certification. I think the DP 300 for data engineering. However, you will need to know the differences between the SQL pools and some of the SQL syntax specific to Synapse Analytics. So we're going to cover 7 main topics in Synapse Analytics. I'm going to go through each one in turn. So the very first one is you can actually integrate Power BI into Synapse Studio itself. Just trying to get rid of that pin at the top. Okay. Now, what you can actually do is integrate multiple Power BI workspaces by creating multiple linked services within Synapse Analytics. And we can actually then create Power BI data sets from either dedicated SQL pools or serverless SQL pools. Now, as Nikola mentioned earlier in the Power BI reusable assets, we are required to actually download a pbids file, which is a file that only contains connection information. We still need to use Power BI datasets, Power BI desktop. We can create and edit reports, okay, and then deploy those to the workspaces that we have connected in Synapse Analytics. Now, the way it looks in Synapse, okay, is that report authoring is available within Synapse Studio. So you can go into the Power BI tab of the develop area and actually open a report and author it within Synapse Studio itself. However, data sets can't be edited within Studio. This is all done through Power BI desktop. Okay, so that's important. When you're authoring data sets, it's not authoring data sets in Synapse Analytics Studio. You're still using desktop, but it kind of automates that connection to a dedicated or a serverless SQL pool. Then if we move on to the SQL pools themselves, okay, so there are 2 pools, dedicated SQL pools and serverless SQL pools. Now we're going to have a look at dedicated first. This is where the data resides within a database structure itself, within familiar tables. So if you're familiar with SQL Server and have a list of tables, or Azure SQL database with a list of tables, it's the same here. You're not going to be expected to know how tables are distributed within dedicated SQL pools, but just to know the data is imported. So it'll be faster than serverless. Supports a large amount of data. Really, we're looking at, you know, a terabyte of data or more within dedicated SQL pools. When we're looking at concurrency with SQL pools, this scales with the service tier. Okay, so at the lowest level, we've got DWU 100, which really only gives you 4 concurrent queries. That scales linearly up to a specific DWU, in which case then the number of connections is fixed to 128 at the far end of the DWUs. But also within dedicated SQL pools, we do have some support for some data governance features. So we have data masking and column level encryption on the dedicated SQL pool side as well. So on serverless, difference to dedicated. So serverless, none of the data exists within serverless SQL pools itself. Okay, serverless is for querying using T-SQL data external to Synapse. Okay, and it supports Azure Storage, Blob Storage, Data Lake Gen 1 and Data Lake Gen 2. And we can create 2 schema objects. We can create external tables and views, okay, which is going to cast structure over that data external. And when we connect serverless SQL pools to external data like Azure Storage, we can use the Synapse managed identity. We can create a service principal and use that, and we can use a user identity as well. Now, in terms of serverless, what we're doing here is we're querying data that's outside of Synapse Analytics, okay? We can actually read and write data to Azure Storage using serverless SQL pools. We'll look at that in a second. However, we've got to use the open row set command. Okay, so this is the command that underpins how serverless talks to these external services. So when you're writing a select statement, open row set is going to be there. With the file path function, okay, which is a SQL function, it actually exposes partitions in a data lake. Okay, so having an understanding of that file path function is very important. We also have a file name function as well that simply returns the name of the file in the data lake that the data for that row that you're seeing in serverless comes from. Okay, as I've said before, we've got external tables and views, and what external tables are is, well, exactly as it says, the data's external. It's not being imported into any form of serverless structure. So all external. And the cost of serverless is all based on the amount of data processed. It's not how long the query takes to run or the level of compute, because you don't have any control over those things. It's the amount of data processed. It's around $5 per terabyte. And also, as I've mentioned previously, there's no configuration of serverless. Okay, you can't add extra nodes. You can't scale. It's all automatic and it's all out of your hands. Okay, so if we're looking at a diagram, we've got serverless SQL pools here. We could read data from Azure Storage, Data Lake Gen 1 and 2, from Cosmos DB, from the Dataverse, if data has been exported, is available in the Dataverse. But we can use a process called CTAS, create external table as select, which will write data. So you can select data from any of those sources and write it back, but only to Azure Storage and Data Lake. And SQL clients ultimately will connect into serverless SQL pools because it exposes a SQL endpoint just like dedicated SQL pools. Now, serverless supports querying nested data types or complex data types in both JSON and Parquet file formats. When we're working with JSON, okay, even though we're working with JSON, we have to tell serverless in that open row set command that it's actually the format is CSV. And we set some values for the field terminator and the field quote and a row terminator in classic JSON. And we've got 3 JSON commands that are supported. We've got JSON value, which can extract a scalar value. We have JSON query, where you've got some more complex data that you're trying to query, and open JSON, where you can actually expand that nested data and join two parent rows. Now in Parquet, we've got access to those same three JSON functions. Yeah. But this time, the format in the open row set command needs to be set to Parquet, but we can still use JSON value, JSON query, and open JSON. Okay. So within a blog that Nikola and I have got, there will be links to the official documentation for those three JSON commands. It's well worth familiarizing yourself with those commands. Now, in terms of visualizations within Synapse itself, in Synapse, and I'm going to bring the chart up as well, actually within the studio, okay, the default will be a table, okay, table of data. But we do have access, if we click on the chart button, to create some basic, and we are talking about basic visualizations here, where we've got access to an area, a bar, column, line, pie, and scatter. Okay, so again, well worth just understanding the chart options on the right-hand side in terms of what needs to go where. Category columns and legend for summing. With Spark Notebook visuals, okay, yes, we've got matplotlib libraries to understand from a basic perspective. Again, there's a Microsoft documentation page that will pretty much give you everything you need to know, right? So we need to import those matplotlib libraries, and this is within a Spark notebook within Synapse. We load a data frame with data. We then use pandas with that data frame. So we load a pandas data frame, and we can then create charts from pandas. So from a code perspective, we use the import matplotlib command. We can populate a data frame. Now, as you can see here, I've just got some static data that I'm populating a data frame with. Then I can convert that data frame to a pandas data frame. And finally, I can just create a chart. Now, the chart type here is hist. There are other types as well. It's useful to understand, let's say, a column chart with multiple categories that you would like to visualize. Again, Microsoft got a documentation page that will take you through an example with what you need to know. And there's our chart within Synapse Analytics Spark Notebook itself. And lastly, we have a predict function available within dedicated SQL pools. Yes, it is a T-SQL function that we can actually use to score using a model that's stored within dedicated SQL pools. Now, at the moment, we have one runtime, the ONNX runtime available. You need to declare the model and load it into a variable, okay? That variable needs to be a var binary max to store the model. But then we can actually, in our statement in which we're using the predict keyword, we can use data from a CTE, a table, a view, or a table valued function. And there's some example syntax. So we're declaring the model at the top with a var binary max variable and loading the model in that we need. Then I have a with statement. That's the data that I want to score. And then lastly, we've got the predict keyword, which, as you can see, I'm passing in my model, I'm passing in my data and the runtime. Okay, so that will be as well something for you to look at. Again, we've got some links in our blog. I think that will be it. So I'm going to hand back over to Nikola to go through the external tools.
Thank you very much, Andy. So yeah, we are slowly wrapping up. Our last subtopic is about external tools. So first, as you see some of them listed here on the slides, let's first explain what are external tools. So external tools are mostly free tools that provide additional capabilities and or ease the development process in the Power BI ecosystem. The main thing to keep in mind regarding external tools, since they are developed by third-party contributors, external tools come with one serious limitation, and that is they're not officially supported by Microsoft. However, that doesn't or that shouldn't minimize their significance and importance, especially for some common business scenarios where Power BI Desktop simply can't accomplish the task, and I will show you in a few minutes. First, let's talk about DAX Studio. That's a very, very comprehensive external tool created by Darren Gosbell. You can use DAX Studio to write DAX. You can perform different kinds of diagnosis, obtain query plans, understand the time spent within the VertiPaq formula engine and storage engine, troubleshoot performance of your queries, format your DAX code. So really many more features that I would say DAX Studio is such an awesome tool that it deserves a dedicated 60-minute session. So these are just the main capabilities of each of these tools. Tabular Editor was created by Daniel Otekir, and this is definitely a go-to tool for data modeling. Not just data modeling, but I would say that's the main purpose of using Tabular Editor. Not just that it supports some of the most popular features, but also some of the features you can create only and exclusively in Tabular Editor, not in Power BI Desktop. For example, calculation groups, setting object level security, custom KPIs. Those are some of the features that can't be used natively from Power BI Desktop. So you need to have external tool, and Tabular Editor is a perfect example how to accomplish those tasks. Of course, Tabular Editor provides a whole range of features to speed up your day-to-day Power BI development. And same as for DAX Studio, Tabular Editor also deserves I would say hour-long dedicated session. At this point, maybe for you, it's important if you're just starting with this to distinguish between two different versions of Tabular Editor. Tabular Editor 2, which is a free version and supports most of these required development tasks like calculation groups and object level security, and Tabular Editor 3, which is a paid version, commercial version, and provides many advanced features. And in my humble opinion, Tabular Editor 3 is a well worth investment that will pay off in the longer run, as it will save you hours, maybe even days of Power BI development. Finally, VertiPaq Analyzer. When you want to understand data storage structures inside the VertiPaq, there is no better tool than VertiPaq Analyzer. Essentially, what VertiPaq Analyzer does, it collects data from various dynamic management views from your tabular model and displays it in a structured, more readable, more understandable, or simply said, more convenient way. Then, yeah, of course, you can go and query all these DMVs on your own using a tool like SQL Server Management Studio, for example, but it's way more convenient to use VertiPaq Analyzer for this. VertiPaq Analyzer is especially useful when you need to determine the data model size because it enables you to understand the size of different data model objects such as tables, columns, relationships, and so on. So you should rely on VertiPaq Analyzer to understand the structure of your data model. And with that being said, as Andy mentioned, those are links in the form of QR codes or URLs to our blogs where you can find all of the things that we were talking about today and many more, of course, that we couldn't cover in this session. And yeah, I would say from my side, thank you for joining our session, Andy.
Thank you very much for joining our session. Yes, the DP500. It appeared, just a few weeks ago. There's been an awful lot of excitement about it because it's bringing together some really good technology. So I'm really pleased that it's had such a positive exposure so far. But thank you for attending.
If there are any questions, I'm scrolling through the chat. Yeah, I saw Andy already answered a lot of them. Yeah, so good luck to all of you folks who are taking exam in the next weeks.
Yes, good luck. And remember, you can always take the exam again. Okay.
Yeah.
So my own, for my,
Good
you know,
point.
I tell you what, in terms of certifications, until Kevin jumps in and says our time is over, I'm going to say I've not passed exams loads of times.
Yeah, same here.
Okay.
Yeah, before we finish, sorry, I forgot to thank Kevin because he's the main culprit why we submitted this session. So
Yes.
he came up with the idea and encouraged us to submit. So thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Nikola and Andy, for the wonderful session.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Deputy. Thank you
yeah.
for moderating.
Attendees love to hear your voice when you speak. So yeah, great job, great job.
Right, I'm going to stop the recording now.
Oh, this was recorded.
Oh yes, I wish I should have really said.
Okay, I stopped sharing.